With over half of enterprise security budgets going towards detection and response in 2020, the challenge is investing in solutions that can scale, migrate, and adapt with your business. Cloud-native security solutions from ExtraHop are purpose-built to help your team respond to threats across the hybrid attack surface. Everywhere your enterprise exists today and wherever it goes tomorrow, ExtraHop is there to secure it. Learn more at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Paul Asadoorian and Jason Albuquerque. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th to April 1st, 2020, at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. Also, our next webcast is this week, January 15th, with Cecilia Marinier from RSA Conference. She is the program director for Innovation and Scholars, and we're going to discuss the Sandbox, the Innovation Sandbox, Launchpad, the Security Scholar Program, and their how-to seminar for innovators and entrepreneurs. Register for our upcoming webcast by visiting securityweekly.com. Select the webcast drop-down and click on the registration tab. All right, gentlemen, let's go through some articles for this week.
Let's do it.
You know, right after the new year, we get all these articles about, trends and resolutions and all this other stuff. This week was a little lighter. I was like, don't throw it all away in the first week. I need good content every week. Oh gosh. But this first article kind of links into the conversation we had last week on my best and worst of 2019 from a leadership perspective. We talked a lot about how Amazon was becoming this factory for CEOs. Well, there's an article out there that talks about some of the unexpected non-traditional companies that are also producing some of the best CEOs. And so I thought it was an interesting article to cover because one of them on the list, Danaher, is one of these behemoth companies that nobody knows, right? Because they don't know them by the Danaher brand. They know them by all their other brands like Fluke and Tektronix and all these other things. And they've spun certain divisions off. But Danaher is just this gigantic company. And one of the former Danaher employees is the one that took over GE. And this article talks about some of these biomedical, medical, industrial types of companies that are producing really, really good CEOs and talks about some of those characteristics of why they're producing good CEOs.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of it comes from the top, right? Your CEO has to have that mentality that they want to be grooming a leadership team, right? So coming onto the article, it just shows that the most innovative CEOs who care about building thought leadership within their teams, they're the ones truly grooming these world-class CEOs to go out there to the market.
Well, and it's an opportunity, I think, for security companies to potentially steal some of these CEOs.
Sure.
And it's a generalization, right? Obviously, Security Weekly, we got Matt to come and be our CEO, which is working out really, really well, of course, right? But there are other companies. So we've got an interview coming up with Doug Song, right? He was co-founder, chairman, and CEO for 10 years at Duo, right? Mm. He was a technical background. Now, he very well could be a unicorn, which also speaks to our interview this week with the Unicorn Project with Gene Kim, right? But every company has to make this decision, right? As founder, we just talked about startups, right? Do you see yourself going into that CEO role? Maybe it's something you need to prepare for. If not, I mean, you may very well have the skills, but not the desire either, right? So I'm not saying it's not something you can't learn. Sure. It's something you can't do. But are your skills better focused on another aspect of the business where maybe you go out and get a CEO, right? And Matt and Jason both, I think we've seen this throughout history in security. Sometimes the formula, they get it right, and sometimes they don't. But it's very much a formula, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's not even that scientific either. And I would it's just about people's skills, where you are in the market. There's a lot of factors that go into how you should structure it. But if you're leading towards, I need to recruit a CEO, it's good to know who's producing these top CEOs, because it's very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would even say that this article translates to any leader, right? Because from my perspective, as a CIO and a CISO, I look at, the 3 practices that they outline here, and I say it's very, very similar to the practices that I implement with my team, right?
Yes.
Because my direct managers, I poke fun and I say it, but my job is to, basically educate you and train you to put me out of a job.
Right.
That's ultimately what I want, right? I want them to have the skill sets that I have, right? So that's what a lot of these CEOs are doing.
You may bring in someone at a CTO level, and those C-level executives need similar skills as to what we're seeing in these articles.
Yeah, and I think this translates to CIOs, to CISOs, right? To leaders within organizations. If you use this, you're going to be grooming top talent, right? It's things like give those leaders within your teams authority to do things, authority to make decisions. Have them out there actually making decisions for the company. Encourage them to think like a leader, right? The trend for these CEOs were encourage them to think like a CEO. Well, I'll encourage them to think like a CISO, right? Encourage my team members to think as if they were in my shoes, right? That way they start getting their mindset in the right place.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is Danaher structured in a way that these principles really work well for them because there's so many different business units. Each business unit provides broad authority. They think like a CEO, and they really manage like a CEO, right? Because it's about profitability. It's about hitting revenue and profit targets, et cetera. That's a CEO, that's part of the CEO's role when it comes to driving the overall business. And so in a company like Danaher, which is very distributed, these principles definitely show up. Now, the question is, when you're in a smaller organization where you don't have a lot of different lines, how do you also do this? And I think there are opportunities to provide broader authority and broader control over the P&L across different organizations that give you those same skill sets to learn how to take on a broader CEO role.
No, agreed. I mean, just some of the examples that they had in here, right? Have folks exposed to the selling side, right? One of the greatest things that my CEO did for me was getting me in the sales cycle, right? They put me in the sales cycle. They had me connecting to clients, really getting that experience of being in front of a customer that a traditional CISO maybe wouldn't have, right? And just getting on the sales side and seeing what, grooming an opportunity, that process of grooming an opportunity, the process of onboarding a client into the organization. Those are huge experiences that I appreciate because it helped me learn the business.
Yeah, and I think, so Paul, to your original point, right? I wasn't the CEO of my original startup because I wasn't ready. I knew I wasn't ready. This is back in 2004, and when we were building Control Path back in the day. I knew I wasn't ready to be a CEO, and some technology leaders want to be that CEO. I get it, right? But where I was in my career, I knew I wasn't ready. So I wanted to hire a CEO. Now, I made the wrong choice in a CEO. And learned a ton from that experience to not ever go through it again. But sometimes you have to go through that process.
Right, to have those failures.
Exactly, to learn from that, to figure out
what
you
not
want
to
do
do.
Next time. Yes.
So you don't make those mistakes here at Security Weekly with us, right?
Yeah.
But take
$1 million and throw it out the window in marketing. Yeah, that didn't work out too well.
It's true, though. You don't look at failure in your candidates as a necessarily a negative thing, right?
Right, exactly right. And look, there are steps along my career where there were failures, but I learned from those failures. And if you learn and you adapt, that's what makes a really good leader, because then you won't fall to that again. And so you're constantly growing and evolving and learning. And I think that's the important part for leaders.
Agreed.
Yeah. The second article, we talk a lot about culture, right? And we want to make sure we build good cultures. This is a very relevant article to us around security incidents and how to create a no-blame culture. I thought this was an interesting article. And at first, Paul, when I started reading it, I thought it was part of your hacker culture blog post. I was like, wait, did they steal that from Paul?
Yeah, no, I like this article because it just highlights the fact of the philosophical mindset change that we need to have, right? I mean, back in the day, there was a lot of peer pressure out to the user base, shaming. I know folks who are peers who would shame folks who would fall victim to phishing attacks, right? And over time we realized that doesn't work, right? Those aren't all that does is create, on the IT side, it creates shadow IT because now they don't want to interface with you, communicate with you, be open with you, or transparent with you because they're afraid. On the security side, it's the same thing, right? They're not going to want to be open and transparent. And for me, a culture within my organization, I want everyone to be transparent. We're not going to shame anyone for accidentally clicking on a link, raise your hand, right? Raise your hand, let us know so it doesn't happen to the rest of the organization.
Well, I think also the media and movies and TV have kind of made technology and hacking look easy, right?
Right.
I mean, we've all seen it when we're watching
Yeah.
something and they're like, oh, I'm just going to hack into XYZ. And they like tap on the keyboard and they're like, oh, I'm in. Hacking is about failing a lot,
Yeah.
right? I think it was Bill Swearingen that was like, with red teamers, you try and you fail, you try, you fail, you try, you fail until you get in, right? And we have to know that failure is part of that and that it's a lot of trial and error to do any type of hacking, whether that's just trying to make something work, right, or trying to break into something. And I think we need to realize that in order to hack into something, you have to make stuff work first. To even build an environment to then go into hacking it, and all of that knowledge builds on each other. And I think people think that hackers have this like magic pixie dust. Remember that IBM commercial, the magic pixie dust, that they can just sprinkle. But what that stems from is trying to gain a deep enough understanding of the technology and the systems to be able to start pointing out flaws, and that it's a process, and a lot of that process is failing.
And we don't want to create a culture where identifying where mistakes or failures happen to impact the overall culture, because in this next article that I brought in around the cultural differences around the world, you'll see that in certain regions, this concept of learning and purpose is really important to the culture. And if you create that negative blame culture, then it really impacts how an organization can function, because when you're in a position where you want to be more learning and from these kinds of mistakes, there's definitely a disconnect in the culture. So I brought the second article in to help leaders understand every part of the world, their cultures are driven by different things.
Yeah.
And if we understand that as leaders, we can do a better job of engaging our employees across these different regions.
Yeah,
Right. And I want everyone on the team to understand that if they're interested in something and they want to go try it and it doesn't work, that's beneficial to everyone, right?
Sure.
And maybe it's just not ready.
Right.
Maybe whatever the case is, but now we know, hey, like that's not where we want to go, right?
Yeah,
Those are
yeah.
good experiences. And you do learn stuff from trying to do that, so that when you get a hold of the next technology, you're like, oh, this one works much better. And I built on the knowledge. Maybe I read, 12 RFCs in preparation for my previous project that failed, right? That's still useful knowledge. Yeah. Knowing what doesn't work and knowing how difficult things are or easy things are, that's what it's all about.
I think the beauty of this article is actually for leaders like us, it actually shows you the different ways you have to handle communications, right? So let's say something, let's say the team is working on an initiative and it does fail. Some cultures would be open to the fact that you're in a team meeting and you highlight the failure. Some cultures that wouldn't play so well, right? Where highlighting the failure in public, that wouldn't play well. So it's one of those things where you have to do kind of in private, one-on-one, talk about it, and that's where it gets received a little bit better, and that's where you can get a better outcome without creating tension across the teams, right? It's tough when you're dealing with international, teams, right? Because the way you communicate to one team, you may have to, knowing the audience, you may have to communicate it differently to another team. And I love the way that this article kind of broke out the different aspects, how people respond to change, how people just interact in general, right? In different ways on how folks from all over the world, they consume on that communication. They consume on those type of leadership interactions. And it was very insightful, extremely insightful.
Yeah, I like this article for two reasons. One, because of the leadership changes that you have to make as you're working across geographic regions. The other thing is I used to do aspects of this as part of my keynotes when I go over to Asia, to the Middle East, right? You have to understand the culture and the audience and how they best consume data, because you have to change potentially your presentation, your speaking style, etc. These are all important from a communication perspective as well. Even if you're just out doing a basic presentation, you go to RSA Conference USA, you may not be able to deliver the material the exact same way when you go to RSA Singapore, for example, because of the cultural differences and the way they'll consume that data.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, one of the, and it shows how some sections of the world are polar opposite to each other, right? So one of the sections was how do people respond to change, right? And when they talked about change, they talked about stability versus flexibility, right? So they looked at Africa as a continent, really, and they did the research, and the focus there is more on flexibility. They like the learning environment.
Africa is a continent.
That's what I said.
Okay.
They looked at all of the countries in the continent.
Oh,
yeah.
You looked at Africa as a continent.
Well, yeah, all of the countries within Africa. Sorry.
Countries
within Africa. Yeah, they polled all of the different countries within the continent. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Got it? All right, cool. But
I thought you were saying they were considering Africa to be a continent.
No.
Like
They just
we're
pulled
past
data
that.
from the entire continent.
But
we're good. We're good. Is there scotch in that?
No,
Yeti?
there isn't. There isn't. There needs to be, maybe.
But no, I mean they take learning and purpose first, right? That's kind of their where their North Star is, let's say. But then Eastern Europe, they're more about authoritarian and safety, right? They want to make sure that safety is the focus within their environment. So you'd be treating that communication totally different, right? If you're communicating to one of the folks from a country in Africa, right? You'd be communicating about the learning opportunity.
Is that on the continent?
All right, next article. This one is for Paul because it's going to save Paul. The guy who invented Inbox Zero says we're doing it all wrong.
Oh,
so
see, I'm
you're
doing it
fine,
right.
Paul.
I just let my inbox fill up and don't read anything. Isn't that's a strategy?
It's doing something, I suppose.
It's doing something.
No, it's not. He's not doing anything. Don't
I
let
did.
him
I
fool
replied
you.
to very specific emails.
Yes. But it was funny because the guy who invented this whole concept of zero inbox says, look, guys, we're all doing it wrong, right? You can't start with a clean slate necessarily. It was just a very interesting article from the original kind of inventor of this concept because I can't get to inbox zero. It's impossible for me to get there. I know this, right? Because I use my inbox as my task assignment tool, right? If it's something I have to do, it stays in my inbox. And it doesn't come out of my inbox until it's done. And unfortunately, I'd love it to be zero, but it's just not realistic.
Yeah, and I mean, let's make sure we take into account that since the inbox zero philosophy was put out there, we got inundated by Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all these other platforms that you have messaging capabilities in, right? So now all of a sudden we're inundated by 52 different platforms that we have to consume messaging on a day, and it's just not possible, right? So a lot of what came out of this article for me, which made me feel a little bit better about how I handle my messaging, is just prioritize. Right? Get to it eventually, but you got to prioritize because you're never going to be able to get to everything.
But I think that's the thing is to have we talked about goals and objectives leading into this year, right? Is to know what those are and make sure you're responding to the stuff and dealing with the stuff that is in alignment with your goals and objectives. And I think one of the other articles we covered said, things that aren't, get them delegated and or ignore them and make those decisions really, really fast. And I think that's the approach that I've kind of taken, which is why I said selective emails I really do pay attention to, right? Because those are the ones that are in line with my projects.
Yeah, and they're going to add the most value to hitting your goals.
Right. I mean, our listeners want more content on container security. If I'm not looking at my inbox from email to and from John Kinsella, then it's not moving. He is the expert on the team in that perspective, right? And they want technical segments, and someone like Bob may have acquired a cell phone jammer, so making sure I remember to bring that into the office and respond to correspondence, setting that up is important. So,
yes, definitely. And if it's really important, I flag it red so it sticks out in my inbox. But if I have to do it, it stays in my inbox.
I'm also a big fan of shorter stand-up meetings as well. We don't do as many scrums as we used to because they got a little too long. But I think there's a balance, right? It's what we just talked about. There's regular meetings to go, all right, we got 5,000 messages across 6 different platforms last week. As a team, we're talking about sales or we're talking about operations. Like, what's most critical? And let's collectively talk in a group. What's critical to ourselves and our business right now and our mission, right? I think that's important to have at least semi-regular, however you want to slice and dice meetings that works best for your organization.
And having those stand-ups, because it's definitely beneficial, for my team as well, having those quick touch-base meetings, it also allows you to address any gaps.
Yes.
If you didn't get to an email or didn't get to a message,
right.
It can get brought up right there
and then
and
the
there.
third thing for me is get those processes out of email, right?
Yeah, totally.
And just do it. In this year, I think we've done a really good job of going, well, rather than passing around email and tickets and all that stuff, like, let's just go add the information where it needs to be in its final resting place,
sure.
right? We've done a lot of that. I'm like, well, then we don't need as many emails in meetings. I think emails and meetings are a lead-in to get you to a place where the process is correct and everyone knows what they're doing because they have an application that they're just going to put their stuff
Unfortunately,
in.
I think some folks, and I'm included in that, thought that having like a Teams channel or a Slack channel or that was going to alleviate the email. But now it's just getting consumed with the same kind of noise. It's just
another place to put memes.
Exactly. It's becoming the same at this point.
It really is.
Yeah. Now, if I can just get stuff out of spreadsheets, we'll be all set.
Yeah, in that too. But they're a great interim measure, right? And it lets you, and like we said in the past, it lets you develop your processes so you have good requirements when you go, okay, do we use an off-the-shelf like SaaS, and what requirements do we have? Do we build something? Do we merge them together? Yeah. These are all questions. I mean, running a SOC, right, is the same thing. How do we get that process and that right information to the right people as quickly as possible?
Wireframe with.
Right? Exactly. Maybe a spreadsheet is the interim, like, holy crap, there's a huge incident, and we're all working off a spreadsheet. You come out of that, you have I am a big fan, having a longer meeting after that. Go, all right, let's look at what happened. Let's look at how we would make this process better. And that's what you're constantly going to be iterating in this field especially, right?
Yes. Last couple articles are a couple interesting surveys. The first one I thought was a really interesting one, how enterprise IT is actually adopting Azure over AWS. We hear so much about AWS and their cloud services and how big they are. And this one doesn't surprise me very much, by the way, Jason. I don't know what your thoughts were on this.
No, I mean, this article I totally see trending with our clients, right? I mean, Microsoft was embedded in the enterprise. So it's just a natural fit for them to kind of slide into the Azure world.
Jason, you especially, I want to get your take on this. What I've noticed is a difference between Azure and AWS. Azure seems to be more production ready, as in, well, the way it's marching forward is more purposeful and very documented processes and services. Whereas AWS, what I'm noticing is they're moving at friggin' light speed. And all of their services, everything is changing, that it's hard for enterprises that are, let's say, doing an Azure, an AD deployment to start considering AWS because stuff changes so rapidly.
Right. And the cool thing about this article is it actually lined out the dynamics of who's going where, right? So Microsoft and the Azure platforms are more enterprise ready for all of those reasons that you're saying. AWS has a lot of focus on the startups and the developers.
Yes.
Right? Because of the reasons you just said.
I want to use the latest framework, and guess what? Amazon's got 3 services that help me deploy that really easily, and while it's not fully well tested yet, I can make it work.
But for portability and for us to be able to migrate quick as an enterprise, have that stability that we know we're going to have as a business, have that level of business resilience, integration into our enterprise apps already, like Office 365, right? Azure Active Directory. It's just a natural port over for the enterprise to go Azure.
Yeah, and this is where we knew we would see Microsoft and Azure really make its stake in the cloud environment, right? They put the stake out there, said, look, if you're Active Directory, your Exchange, your Microsoft, we're going to make it really easy to move you here as an enterprise. And that's what they've done. Very methodical. That's their niche. AWS has gone after, obviously the developers and the startups and in the early communities that need the latest, greatest technology to innovate and continue to disrupt. That puts Google in this really weird position. And this article even pulls it out. It says, look, they're dropping off. They're better than they were 3 years ago, but you're seeing them drop off. And this has been the big question for Google is, where do they stake their claim in the cloud to position themselves?
So here's what I'll say. I see Google a lot in the EDU space.
Yeah.
K through 12, higher ed, really staked in the Google environment. Now, my question is that on purpose? Did they do that so they kind of set the stage for the next generation coming into the workforce and say, you've been on Google your entire education?
A lot of the people coming into the workforce, especially with development mindset, they know at least pieces and parts of AWS because that's in their curriculum. Yeah, their email might be hosted in Google, and there might be a class or two, but
Right.
let's face it, when they're doing an internship or fellowship or whatever, or research project even, they're going to AWS, right? I mean, you can stand up infrastructure for free. It's very well documented in AWS. I mean, I was messing around.
Yeah, I just didn't know if it was by design. Did Google go after the
Could be.
EDU space by design is the question.
I haven't looked into Google Cloud as much as I probably should, but
Because it's prevalent in the EDU space.
yeah. But also it's depending on what you're working with. Like I was looking at a project and they're like, oh, here's a build script for Beanstalk. I'm like, oh, that's a great first step into learning some of Google's cloud services, right? Because you're not configuring 12 different services from the bat. Beanstalk is making it easy and doing a lot of the work on the back end, but it gives you kind of that primer for it. And they've got apps that are already pre-built in there. So if you want to go get your feet wet with Beanstalk, you can do a free tier, which for students, right, is great, and go in and do that and learn.
Yeah. This last article I thought is going to be one of these themes for this year, and this is all about privacy and the balance of privacy and insider threat, and this ongoing debate that I think is only going to pick up momentum this year when we think about CCPA and what GDPR has already done in Europe. And it's this very delicate balance about how do I detect for insider threats, but also give a level of privacy to my employees? This is a big challenge.
Oh, it's a huge challenge, right? And I mean, from the statistics that they gave from the respondents, it's just getting worse, right? Because in 2015, they said insider caused 26% of data breaches. Now it's at 48% in 2019. So for me, I look at it in an exercise of collaboration across the entire business units of the organization, right? It has to be a partnership with IT, security, HR, legal, and we really have to be able to strike that balance together because, I can't just with the stroke of a pen make a decision on insider threat without involving these teams because there's too much at stake, way too much at stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, HR's got to be here. You've got to have solid policies, good communication. Yep. There has to be a good coordination here. Otherwise, this is going to get crazy.
And if you're teetering on the edge a little bit, you need legal opinion. 100% get legal opinion because the last thing you want is for one of your employees to sue you because of a control you put in place.
Or potential employee, right? If your screening process hasn't been blessed by legal, you could get yourself potentially into, I'm not a lawyer, right? But you could get yourself into legal trouble.
But the risk is there.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for joining us, everyone. And we'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.